This is the Multifaith Matters podcast. I'm your host, John Moorhead. I'm John Moorhead. I'm the host of the Multifaith Matters podcast. And whether you're listening today or watching via YouTube, you are welcome. I hope you find this conversation helpful. I do want to note that we have other podcasts available. If you came to this podcast through our podcast page, you can see the listing there. You can also find them in video format on the YouTube page. And on our website at Multifaith Matters, you can find a variety of additional resources, recommended books and articles, and we provide consulting services to help evangelicals. And all of this is aimed at helping evangelicals not only have concerns about the Great Commission, about wanting to share their faith with others, but also the Great Commandments, loving God and loving neighbors. And in this context, our multi-faith neighbors. And I do need to mention at the beginning here that we're a nonprofit organization. And if you find this podcast and the work that we're doing helpful, please consider supporting it financially. There is a patrons page where you can support for as little as $1, $3, or $5 a month, or you can make a one-time donation to our website. So thank you again for tuning in and listening and watching. My guest today, talking about American Buddhism, is George Draffan, and I'm going to read a little bit of his bio here so we can get to know him. George is a Seattle-based teacher and coach who is passionately interested in bringing together diverse Buddhist and Taoist practices to benefit people. He began studying Buddhism at the University of Wisconsin in the 1970s. Since then, he's received instruction and participated in many retreats with teachers in the Tibetan, Theravadin, and Zen Buddhist traditions. He's also practiced Taoist philosophy and Qigong for many years. His practice of embodied movement has been deeply influenced by physical labor, mountain hiking, and the gentle therapy of, I hope I don't butcher this, George, Feldenkrais. Is that correct?
Yes.
It is. Wow, I got it. George's practice and teaching emphasizes direct awareness of the body as the ground of all experience, relying on compassion, awareness, and skillful means, maintaining intention and flexibility in the midst of daily life activities. Other influences for which George is grateful include the mountains, rivers, and wildlife of the Pacific Northwest, the ecstatic, all-embracing empathy of the poet Walt Whitman, and the simple humanity of the poet, hopefully this is correct, Tufu?
Tufu, yes.
Okay. And the writings of Stoic philosophers who challenge to use our innate abilities to free ourselves from self-imposed confusion and reactions. And lastly, George has been a volunteer with the Northwest Dharma Association for more than 25 years, organizing events and at various times serving on the board and as executive director. I could go on. There's so much that you've done and you're involved in, but George, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Yeah. You and I were talking a little bit before we started the podcast here. It was our mutual friend, Paul Louis Metzger at New Wineskins of Multnomah that connected us. And we've had some prior conversations about our religious communities and religious diplomacy. And as I was thinking about people to have conversations with, you came to mind. And this podcast is designed for evangelicals and conservative Christians to help them see respectful conversations with people in other religious traditions in the hopes that they'll want to do that too. And you and Paul have been involved in that good work. But to help viewers and listeners get to know you, I like to begin my podcast when possible with people's journeys. How did you come to embrace Buddhism?
Well, growing up in the 60s and 70s, I encountered it as a teenager through books. There weren't very many books on Buddhism back then, as opposed to now. But there was something about it that made sense to me as a way to look at the world and look at life. And when I went to college, I for lack of a practical livelihood intention, I majored in Buddhist philosophy, and it made even more sense. I went to college at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and there was one of the first three Tibetan teachers that immigrated to the United States was based there. And so I took classes from Geshe Sopa, and at that time, you either went into Chinese language or Tibetan language if you wanted to take the senior courses. And I tried a little of both and failed utterly. So I not only dropped the major, but I dropped out of college for about 10 or more years. So the philosophy made sense to me. It wasn't until later, late 20s, early 30s, when I had a few personal crises that I actually tried to practice it. And by then there were other teachers, and there were American teachers who had been authorized. And so it was a little easier going to actually get involved and be part of a community. So I started out with it as an intellectual, pursuit, and it became a personal practice when I needed it. So that just reinforced my interest in the sense it made of the world and my life.
I know there's some debate among scholars of religion. Do you personally consider Buddhism a religion, a philosophy, both? What would be your perspective on that?
It is both. And if you look at the diversity of Buddhism, not only across Asia, where the views and the culture of Buddhism in India is not the same as it is in Thailand, and it's not the same as it is in Japan or Burma or wherever Buddhism goes, and maybe this is true of other religions too, wherever Buddhism goes, it adapts to the culture, and the culture changes it. So there may be an essence, and depending on who you talk to, Buddhism's got the Eightfold Path or certain essential features, but it really adapts to the culture, and it becomes a religion for many people, and it mixes with the religion of the place. So in Tibet, they were shamanic. It was a pagan and a very old religion. And when Buddhism came, it adapted to some of that. And so it's most definitely a religion. For other people, it's a philosophy. They may never meditate. In fact, there's traditions of Buddhism where meditation is not the norm. It's a way, it's an ethical way of living. It's a philosophical view. It's an intellectual pursuit, or there's devotion and ritual. And so not only within the different cultures, but I think for each practitioner, it's more or less a religion with some supernatural features. It's a philosophical tradition that's mainly intellectual. So it really varies, but anybody says, Buddhism is this and not that, then you probably have the same problem in Christianity. You can't sum it up in one thing and say it's this, not that. It depends on who's practicing it.
Yeah, I think there might be a little more willingness to embrace that diversity of expression, at least in Protestantism, and probably I think also in Catholicism. There's more of a tendency to say, no, this is the essence. And if you go beyond that, then, it's a problematic form of Christianity. So,
well, Buddhism, some Buddhists do that too. There you go. There are fundamentalist Buddhists who say, these texts and these practices are Buddhist, and those other things that the people in such and such a country do is not Buddhism. It's been perverted. There are fundamentalist Buddhists as well. But the more I study it, and the more I look at the different cultural manifestations of it, I see some common elements. The ethics, the insight meditation, the way of approaching things is common across them, but the way it manifests and the way it's practiced and the way it's talked about is very different. And there are people who say, no, it's this one and not that one. To me, that doesn't, it belies
credibility or historical facts. I guess I'm just another Buddhist, and I say Buddhism is a religion and a philosophy, and it's many things, and that's just my take. Other
Yeah.
people will disagree and say, those Tibetans, when they mixed in the shamanic elements, they ruined it, or such and such, and it still goes on today. We bring, health professionals and scientists have tried to isolate, still working on it, isolating how mindfulness works and what it does to the brain and nervous system, and how it changes your biochemistry. And there are quite a few Buddhists that say that it's a terrible thing to do, and that you're trying to lift it out of the context that it was arose in, and that it's not the real thing. But it's hard to argue with biochemistry and brain science. So
Yeah, it does get a little messy. I mean, you have similar debates and discussions about yoga. Can it be, extracted or practiced outside of its Hindu context? Is it inherently religious? These kinds of things. So I just think this illustrates that this is, I think religion as a category, we try and make it very neat. We define it, but it's really something that we're imposing on the world that could be kind of messy and difficult to sort out. So you and I, through this conversation, we're just doing our best to try and help each other understand a messy process.
yeah, and I'm trying to through the Northwest Dharma Association, we're trying to take each of the different traditions and lineages at face value and regard them as legitimate religions or philosophies or ways of life that are practiced by people for 2,500 years. And so if you start with that premise that a religion or a way of life or an ethical set of principles that somebody practices and holds dear to their life and central to the way they see the world, if you take that as legitimate, then you have to look a little deeper at the surface differences in the way the language people use and the way they describe things, and actually look at what the practice does for someone. And to me, a religion or spirituality, again, the language is kind of fuzzy, but to me, the central part of it is, does it change the way you look at the world and treat other people? Does it change your way of life? And does it begin to bring other people to the same level of importance as yourself? That's what's authentic religion to me. And whether it's Christian or Jewish or Muslim or Buddhist or whatever, if it does that, if it stretches us beyond ourselves, then it's legitimate and it's authentic, and the expressions of it and the way it's practiced is to be understood rather than kind of taken apart and said judged as legitimate or not.
I note in your bio that in addition to Buddhism, there's also some Taoism that's mentioned in there. How does that complement? Does it complement? Is it secondary? How would you describe the relationship between your Buddhist practice and Taoism?
It's very complementary, and there's actually a lot of parallels. Taoism emerged as one of the indigenous religions or philosophies of China about the same time as Buddhism was arising in India. And when Buddhism went to China, the Indian Buddhism was combined with the Chinese Taoism, and they came up with Zen. If you look at Zen, a lot of the literature and a lot of the practices are quite Taoist. So Taoism is a really old, it was, they began to write about it in the centuries before the current era, but it's really old. shamanic, it's matrilineal, it's earth-based, it's looking at the elements, it's trying to understand how nature works and then align humans with natural laws and natural energies. And it has its own complexities and its own practices, but the original Lao Tzu, the Tao Te Ching, which many people have read, and Zhuangzi, which is a wonderful collection of stories and jokes and puns and teaching stories, those arose around 300 or 400 BC and formed the basis of philosophical Taoism. Taoism also kind of grew up and furthered the practice of Tai Chi and Qigong, which is the movement, mindful movement and energy practices. And so they're kind of intertwined from the beginning. But the Tai Chi is also really helpful if you do a lot of sitting meditation, which isn't actually very good for the body. The human body isn't meant to sit still for 45 minutes or an hour at a time. And on retreat, I was working with a teacher who decided that walking meditation was a lot of trouble to get to everybody stand up, put on their shoes, file out of the meditation hall outside. And by the time you did that, time had passed and everybody was all disturbed. So we started standing up right in front of the meditation bench and doing Tai Chi right there. And it was more helpful than walking meditation. Well, I started doing more and more of that. And then I discovered that in teaching meditation, one of the best ways to teach someone to sit still is to teach them Tai Chi first. They get grounded in the body, they connect with their breath, they get some flexibility and some stretching, and then when they sit down to meditate, they actually feel like sitting down and being grounded and resting, whereas a lot of people, when they try to meditate, they just get more and more tense. And so if you want to teach somebody how to do sitting meditation, teach them Tai Chi first. So very complementary, and I think very, aside from the health and flexibility and there's studies now even showing that people are happier doing Tai Chi, going back again to the physiology and the biochemistry of it. So it's been very helpful to me, and I might skip a day of meditation, but I hardly ever skip a day of Tai Chi.
Can you help us a little bit with the history? How did Buddhism come to America? Was it during the 1960s with the increase in immigration, or were there other factors involved?
It was actually older. The Japanese that moved to Hawaii in the 1800s, a lot of them to work in the plantations, brought Pure Land Buddhism from Japan. And as soon as there was immigration into the US from Asians, whether Chinese or Japanese or other, they brought Buddhism with them. So it's been in America for well over 100 years. The oldest temple in Seattle is about 115 years old, I think. Wow. The Seattle Betsuan. So it's been around, but it was an immigrant religion. And of course, most Americans, Euro-Americans weren't very interested or didn't have the opportunity to actually learn anything about it. But in the 1930s, 1940s, there were several Asian scholars, D.T. Suzuki and others, that came and spent time in America and started writing the first books in English that could make it more accessible. And so it built from there. In the 50s, the Beat writers popularized it. Alan Watts, who was an Episcopalian minister, was a Taoist and Buddhist, and he popularized it. And then in the 60s, there was teachers from Japan, China, Tibet, and Sri Lanka, other countries, came here and actually established centers. So by the 60s and 70s, you could actually train in it. And so we, people my age tend to think of the 60s and 70s as kind of the first generation, but it was 100 years old by then. It's just that it was the first generation where we could actually get access to it and get thorough training. And since then, even in the 25 years I've worked with the Dharma Association, it's just exploded in popularity, in access, in the number of translations and books that are written. And it's now well beyond the kind of Asian cultural religious traditions to a scientific study of meditation and what it does in an objective sense. So it's definitely, it started out small as an immigrant religion, and now is mainstream. Many hospitals will teach mindfulness-based stress reduction for chronic pain that drugs just can't work with, and public schools are teaching mindfulness meditation because it calms kids down and gets them focused and gets them able to do some, deliberate work. Helps learning, makes you more intelligent when you've got oxygen in your brain, and so it's even in the last 10 years, it's really expanded.
Oxygen in the brain is always a good thing. So,
That's
well, that's interesting and good to know about the longer history in America than I was aware of. What are some of the major expressions of Buddhism in America that listeners ought to be aware of that they might run into?
Well, it's often said that there's insight. Buddhism comes in 3 or 4 forms, like insight meditation, or Tibetan meditation, or Zen meditation. And these, again, are just kind of shorthand and really oversimplified based on the traditions that have the most centers or have been around the longest. But if you look at all the countries in Asia, and then you look at the traditions within those countries, you end up with more of a view, kind of like Christianity, where you could break it into Catholic and Protestant and evangelical. But then if you look within each of those, and maybe even more so in Buddhism, I mentioned how Taoism had affected Buddhism in China. But you take Indian Buddhism, you add in some Taoism, and you get Zen. Well, Zen was often practiced alongside Pure Land Buddhism, which is a very devotional, not very much meditation, a little bit of chanting maybe, or singing, but it's mostly devotional, and it's mostly community-based. So it's not so much insight meditation as just the understanding that other people are at least as important as you are, and that community is more important than any individual's preferences or prejudice. And so you just serve other people, and that's the practice. And those who like to meditate and get into extraordinary mental states will say, well, that's not much of a practice. Well, try it. Put the other person first all the time. Put your family and community ahead of your own preferences all the time. It's a practice, and it changes the way you view things, and it changes the way you have to live. So, and I think I mentioned 6 Ways of Being Religious, a textbook by Dale Cannon. And his 2 case studies are Christianity and Buddhism, but he brings in a lot of other religions too. And his thesis is that there are 6 ways of being religious, and they range from shamanic religion, where you're channeling supernatural powers, to mystical or meditation, mystical quest, You've got devotion as a way of being religious. You've got reasoned inquiry and philosophy as a way of being religious. And so he says that any developed religion, any authentic religion, is actually going to have all six of these ways. And sometimes a lineage or a tradition practices one more than the other. But if you really study it, there'll be at least two or three. And the larger, more developed traditions actually have all six. And so maybe an easier way to think about it is your mind. So that would be meditation and philosophy, and then your heart, which is devotion, and ritual is another of the six, and right action, either individual or social. And so our behavior and our emotions and our mind are all involved. And so whether you're looking at Zen, which says we don't, one of their tropes is that they don't rely on texts. So there are many Zen stories of how they tried to understand a text and got frustrated and just threw it out or burned it up. And they said, I'm not going to rely on a text. I'm going to, realize this in my own experience. But they also bow. They also ring bells. They also have revere and respect and follow a lineage of teachers down through the centuries. So all of the traditions have these different aspects of mind and heart and behavior. And there's kind of infinite varieties within each of those. But again, if we look at religion as something that changes how I experience and how I act, then to be genuine and long lasting, it's got to involve the head and the heart and the behavior, the way of life.
My assumption is that most, if not all, of the evangelical viewers and listeners will have very little, if any, knowledge of Buddhism, and maybe a lot of stereotypes. Can you kind of summarize? I know there's a wide variety of traditions. You've touched on some of that, but what are some of the essential, what's the history? How did Buddhism arise? And then what are some of the essential practices and beliefs associated with it?
The Buddha, Shakyamuni, the original, or other traditions say there were Buddhas before him, but the historical Buddha lived in the 5th century BC in India, which at that time there were different kingdoms, different kind of state-size kingdoms. They also had the beginnings of the caste system already, and the Buddha was born into the military class that was beginning to be a merchant class and was quite wealthy. And he was sheltered as a boy, and then he discovered illness, and he saw a corpse, and he discovered that there was suffering in the world. And he left his privileged position and went into the forest with the yogis and looked for truth and the end of suffering. Well, India at that time was polytheistic. They had lots of gods and goddesses. And he came through his own practice to think that maybe the gods and goddesses were just other beings and they weren't absolute, and that he had to do something himself, that he couldn't rely on luck or good fortune or the grace of gods and goddesses. And he created what was actually is actually a very rational system. So the Four Noble Truths, the first thing he taught was that suffering exists, suffering arises. And there is suffering in life. You can't You can't stop it. The cause of it is craving, is tanha in Sanskrit, is the kind of craving if you drink salt water, you just get thirstier. The kind of craving that you can't satisfy. Craving is the cause of suffering. That's actually shorthand. The craving is actually caused by confusion. So you're confused if you drink salt water, hoping to get over your thirst. Confusion causes craving, it causes hatred, it causes jealousy, it causes pride. We don't understand ourselves or the way things actually are, and so we have these reactive emotions. We don't understand the true causes of happiness and unhappiness. So the third noble truth is that this kind of confusion can come to an end. And the fourth noble truth is the Eightfold Path to bring that kind of confusion and suffering to an end. And the Eightfold Path goes through view, the way you see things, is it accurate or not? Your intentions or your resolve, is that aligned with the way things are? And then it has several about speech, action, livelihood, and ethical behavior. So about half of the Eightfold Path is about how you behave. And then the seventh and eighth are mindfulness and meditation. And so it's a way of life. And there are many people who don't want anything to do with Asian history or culture, but have discovered in Buddhism a way of clarifying your own experience and the nature of the world, and approaching life in a way that is conducive to happiness and skill and harmony with other people. And so there's lots of people who don't care about the origins of it and the religious aspects, but they see something, it's almost akin to Stoicism. So the Stoics came up about the same time, several centuries before the current era, and they arose in Rome and Greece that had a polytheistic set of gods and goddesses and different ways of trying to appeal to them and get their aid. And the Stoics said, well, maybe. They took a rather agnostic view about it, but they also said there are some things we can do ourselves. And even if we're going to appeal for the help of supernatural forces or supernatural beings, we need to do some things ourselves. Isn't there a Christian, God helps those who help themselves or something like that? I can't do whatever I want and behave however I want and be as confused as I want and then expect someone else to help me. So you can be a Stoic and a Christian. You can also be a Buddhist and a Christian in that sense, where Buddhism is about this life and how I see and behave. And so it's not incompatible with other religions. It does put the responsibility and the test of experience on oneself. One has to take responsibility, and one has to try to see things accurately. There's a famous poet, Shantideva, who wrote an epic poem on the Bodhisattva way of life. And one of his verses is, we all want happiness, but we keep doing the things that bring us unhappiness. And so that's what the essence of Buddhism is trying to get at. There is cause and effect, and we don't expect miracles, or we don't rely on miracles. There may be miracles, but we can't count on them. Like, I'm not going to go to work, but I want to be rich. Cause and effect demands that I be clear about what I'm experiencing and be clear about the true causes of happiness and unhappiness and harmony and discord. It's up to me.
That's helpful. I want to comment. You mentioned the phenomenon of dual or multiple religious identities. And I think that is happening more and more. People are reporting that they're not just identifying with one religious tradition. They might hold, to two or more than one. So you'll have folks who would say that they're Buddhist Christian or Christian Buddhist. I think from the conservative Christian perspective, they're probably far less comfortable with that than maybe you would be within the Buddhist community because of your view of it as a religion and philosophy. A lot of there's one of the things I've discovered in my research is there's a fear amongst conservative Christians, particularly evangelicals, about syncretism, what they would consider the inappropriate blending of different religious traditions so that one compromises the other. And so I don't want us to go off on a tangent, just to note that there are differences between our traditions in terms of how they would understand that. But at the same time, I think we need to recognize that increasingly that's taking place with folks kind of viewing religion more as a smorgasbord of options that one has rather than, fidelity to just one religious tradition. I think we're going to see that more and more. Any follow-up comments on that?
Well, I think that is it can be a problem. I think I'm going to try to, the sun is coming through the window.
There we go.
I think it can be a problem either way. If you just go from one religion or one philosophy or one kind of devotion or meditation to the next and never stick to it and let it change you, then it may just be avoidance and again, confusion about how things work. There's also a problem, I think, if you stay within a tradition and don't know or care or learn anything about other traditions, not only is there a danger of misunderstanding or being biased or being self-centered, but there's a danger of conflict with other people. And so when I discovered Pure Land Buddhism, which is a very devotional, very different than the kind of self-disciplined effort that I've been describing in meditation and philosophy, that says the universe is compassionate, the universe is good, and that my foibles and my inability to understand everything is inherent. I can't lift myself by my bootstraps. And so I'm just going to I'm going to surrender to the way the world is, and I'm going to trust that it's a compassionate universe, and I'm going to put other people first, and I'm going to stop worrying about my own advancement and enlightenment. When I discovered that there was a tradition of Buddhism like that, it sure reminded me of growing up as an Episcopalian in a cathedral in the Midwest that had lots of incense and lights and ritual, and part of it was done in Latin, and I was a altar boy and wearing a robe and everything, and so it brought me back to my original sense of what religion was, and it helped me to understand what the attraction is. It helped me to understand what the power of devotion is. And so, should I have stayed Episcopalian and never learned about Buddhism? Or once I had converted to Buddhism, should I have never, thought about the parallels with Episcopalian? So I think it's a danger either way. If we think we're self-contained and we don't need to learn anything about other people, then that leads to something. And if we just dance around and think we don't need to have any discipline or hold ourselves accountable or go through a spiritual path ourselves, then that leads to problems too.
And like all of these things, it's not so simple as to say, well, you should do this or you should do that. There are plenty of people in every religion that say their own understanding and their own sincere practice was really enhanced by seeing how someone else practiced their religion. Doesn't mean you adopt it or that you get confused. You may actually get clearer about what you're doing and what's important and why you practice the way you do. But the great multi-faith leaders and people that have inspired over the centuries have respected other religions. In Tibet in the 1800s, as Tibet was about to be destroyed by colonial powers and the fact that it was sandwiched between China and India, but on the verge of the destruction of old Tibet, there were several decades where the different lineages in Tibet said, let's stop debating and let's stop being isolated from each other. Let's learn about each other's traditions. We keep our own. We don't mush them all together and make a mess out of it. Let's keep our own traditions, but let's learn about the others and understand where they're coming from and respect those. And so this Rime, or without boundaries movement, actually resulted in the writing down and the collection and the encyclopedic understanding of 1,500 years of Tibetan religion right before everything was destroyed. It basically saved Tibetan Buddhism in all its diversity, because these leaders said, this isolation, it can't go any further. We have to go back and understand what we have in common as well as what we have in difference. And so they didn't create a big mishmash. They illuminated their own tradition by understanding other people's.
I one of the things I appreciate about Buddhism is that idea of recognizing suffering. I think that's something that Christians recognize too, although we would understand the remedy to be different. But not only is there suffering, there's also misunderstanding. What kinds of stereotypes and misunderstandings do you run into that Christians have about Buddhism? And do you find any in the Buddhist community about Christianity?
Oh, yes. Where do we start? I think a lot of Christians see, well, I won't even say Christians, I'll just say Americans, because so many Americans don't really have any religion now. But I would say a big misunderstanding about Buddhism is that people don't even know the difference between Buddhism, Hinduism, Sikhs, Muslim, like anybody that's vaguely Asian or has some kind of Asian clothing on is a this or a that. So there's that misunderstanding. Anything that's foreign, Buddhists have been attacked because people thought they were Muslims. So because they wore a robe or something. So there's a basic lack of understanding about Buddhism as a religion and as a cultural phenomenon. There's also, I think, a lot of people see a Buddhist bow to a statue of the Buddha and they think, oh, it's idolatry. Well, it's no more idolatry than kneeling when you go into a church. There's this. A Buddhist knows that the statue is just made out of metal or wood. There's nothing magical in that object, except that it's a symbol of the path and the religion and the lineage and the teachers. So it's not pagan, it's not idolatry, it's not superstitious. And that there's a huge difference. Not all Buddhists believe in reincarnation. Reincarnation came out of a Hindu. The Buddha was a Hindu well, not even Hindu, pre-Hindu, because Hindu and Buddhism kind of came up together in the current era, but the Vedic and Upanishad, the pre-Hindu religion, indigenous religion, believed in reincarnation. So it's kind of like Jesus being a Jew. He reformed Judaism or made some changes and it became Christianity, but the Buddha was an Indian, not a Buddhist. He created or inspired what came, but if you go to China or Japan, there's very little focus on the afterlife and reincarnation. Very different worldview that came out of their own indigenous. So just like you couldn't make assumptions about evangelicals by watching a Catholic mass, there's different kinds of Buddhism, and they can't all be conflated. On the other side, Buddhists misunderstanding Christians. Well,
Yes.
If you're an Asian Buddhist and were born that way, then I imagine you see Christianity. Europeans are Christian. That's what a Christian is, a European, right? If you're Asian. But if you're a convert Buddhist like me, we may have, I was raised as an Episcopalian, but by the time I was a teenager, I was more interested in Buddhism. So I imagine I have a kind of an adolescent view of Christianity. I've tried to remedy that by studying and talking with people, but I'll probably never understand it again as an insider. So I'm a little fuzzy on the different Protestant traditions and what the differences and similarities are. I'm a little fuzzy on what evangelicalism is. And of course, it all gets filtered through culture. So I think some of us may think of evangelicalism as a political movement,
Right.
because that's what's happened in the last 10 or 20 years. We don't understand where it came from, what inspired it, what the central goals or orientation are. We think of it as what the people with public microphone say. And so again, I think we can't get anywhere as a culture or as a world or even as a particular religion unless we have enough respect for other people's path to try to actually understand it, rather than what we see filtered through the media or filtered through the loudest voices.
That ending of what you just said there leads naturally to, as our time begins to draw to a close, we have our differences. So we're not saying that Buddhism is the same as Christianity. We can say that there are some areas where we might have some agreement, but so we're not compromising. But in spite of those differences, we can work together to make our communities a better place. Do you have any thoughts on how neighborly minded Buddhists and evangelicals might come together to work for the common good of not only the neighborhood, but the country?
Well, I think by approaching your neighbor and talking, learning more about where they're coming from and why they do what they do. It's not easy to do, and you can't do it by having one conversation, or I could go sit in a church service and then come out thinking I understood, but of course all I'm doing is just being exposed a little bit, and then the inquiry and the understanding continues. But since there are so many differences, even within Buddhism or within evangelicals, we can't even say we understand our own tradition completely, if only because they keep evolving and growing. But there are some similarities. I think the golden rule is virtually every religion, and even the secular philosophies like Stoicism, virtually every spiritual path has some version of the golden rule. And some of them, maybe all of them, for the serious practitioner, will go even further. Not only, are others equal to you, but that you should exchange yourself for others, and you should put others first. Every spiritual tradition says that. And if that's the case, then I think we can trust, to reach out across the aisle and go into each other's churches or temples and actually have a dialogue without fear that we're going to lose the essence of our path, or that we're going to compromise the integrity. It's a question of understanding how everybody else comes to that golden rule. Nobody argues against the golden rule.
Right, right.
Nobody argues against prohibitions on murder and stealing and adultery. Every religion has a version of those. And so I think, despite the diversity of how we express or follow that, the essence is the same. We're human, and we live in a world that is infinitely larger than our little brains, and we're social creatures that need to interact and get along and be supported by and support each other. And if you start from there, then everything else is details.
Yeah, I would draw the attention to the work in your neck of the woods that, again, Paul Louis Metzger of New Wine, New Wineskins is doing. For many years, they have been participating in potlucks with members of the Dharma Reign Zen Buddhist community. And folks who are interested in that can find a case study on our website with the example of other evangelical churches that are relating to religious others in their community in neighborly ways. And I think there was even an article in Tricycle that focused on these potlucks that were going on. So that's a marvelous example of Christians and Buddhists getting together without compromise, in integrity, and having relationships and conversations to make their communities a better place. So it certainly can be done. We just need more of it.
Yeah, I think we need to get out of our well, it's difficult. People are busy, and there is the need to understand one's own tradition and to follow it faithfully. And for most of us, maybe at times all of us, that's the most we can manage. And yet again, I think one's own tradition can be illuminated by dialogue with others.
Yeah, you and I were talking before we started the podcast about you said one of the great challenges in your work with Buddhists is they just don't have the interest. They're focused on their own religious practices and community. And it's the same thing, I think, in evangelicalism and others, where we only have so much time in life, we're busy, and we're all focused on our own communities, our own religious practice. However, I think you and I would both make the argument that while that's important, it's also important to try and understand the religious others, if you will, because our disagreements in culture through politics over some of the most important questions of our day are many times informed by our religious traditions and our religious community. So for no other reason, we need to understand why our neighbors view the same issues so differently, and why we disagree so passionately, so that we can at least disagree in a more informed and respectful kind of way. So there are good incentives for us trying to make time to understand and talk to each other.
Yeah.
Well, George, do you have anything else as we draw to a close? Any burning thing you would like to communicate? Or I know it's a huge subject matter. We've only been able to scratch the surface.
Well, no, I just would like to thank you for inviting me. And it's this conversation and the ones we've had previously, and the conversations I've had with Paul Metzger have been very helpful. And I'm inching ever so slowly toward a more ecumenical. My work with the Northwest Dharma Association has been primarily to support the particular Buddhist traditions and temples and centers across the Northwest. So that's the mission. but I also think in order to do that, in order to support Buddhists, we need to do some more interfaith and multi-faith work outside our own community, because otherwise we're kind of training to be isolated and pretending that the diverse and confusing world isn't all around us. And so I just want to thank you and Paul and others for helping us stretch a little bit more. I think it'll benefit ourselves as well as others. So.
No, I appreciate you carving the time. I wish we would have done it sooner, but I'm glad we did it. And hopefully our conversation here, maybe that'll rekindle some additional thought about how we can do more together in the Pacific Northwest and elsewhere between Buddhists and evangelicals. So I thank you as well for making the time. My guest has been George Draffan. I will have his bio in the program notes and some links where you can get in touch with his work. And again, we hope you find this podcast helpful. Please take a look at the other podcasts there. Give us a positive rating, subscribe on the YouTube page. And once again, we appreciate your financial support that makes the podcast and the work of Multifaith Matters possible. I'm the host, John Moorhead, and we will see you on the next podcast.